The doorman's hand stayed firm on Bumpy Johnson's chest, his voice low and cutting, promising humiliation instead of entry, certain the night would end in violence. Certain Harlem's rules stopped at that door. The rain had stopped 10 minutes earlier, leaving the street slick and reflective, like the city was holding its breath. Bumpy Johnson stood beneath the awning without shaking the water from his coat. He didn't rush. He never did. Time bent differently around men who didn't need permission. The club's entrance glowed warm behind frosted glass. Music leaked out in muffled pulses, brass, laughter, the careless sound of people who believed the night belonged to them. The line outside was thin, suits, fur collars. Women with gloved hands and painted smiles. Most of them didn't look at Bumpy. The few who did looked away quickly, uncertain of what they were seeing. The doorman was thick through the shoulders, uniform pressed tight across his chest. He had the posture of a man paid to say no and the confidence of someone who'd never been punished for it. When Bumpy stepped forward, the man lifted a hand without turning his head. "Not tonight," the doorman said. Bumpy stopped. He didn't argue. He didn't step back. He stood close enough to smell the starch on the man's cuffs. "I wasn't asking," Bumpy said, calm, even almost courteous. The doorman finally looked at him then. His eyes traveled slowly, hat, coat, shoes taking. His time, letting the pause do the talking. Around them, the street noise thinned. A couple behind Bumpy shifted uncomfortably, already sensing they were standing inside something they didn't understand. "This is a private club," the doorman said. His voice dropped, sharpened. "Members only." Bumpy nodded once, as if acknowledging a point in a longer conversation. "I know what it is." The doorman's mouth tightened. He stepped closer, invading space on purpose, his hand flattening against Bumpy's chest. Not a shove, something worse. A decision. "You know where you are," the doorman said. "You know who comes through this door?" Bumpy looked past him, at the glass, at the movement inside. Men laughing too loud. A trumpet flaring somewhere deeper in the room. He looked like a man listening to a memory. "I know exactly where." "I am," Bumpy said. The hand stayed on his chest. Fingers pressed, testing. The insult was precise, clean, designed to leave no marks and plenty of witnesses. "Then you know you don't belong." The doorman said. That word belonged hung between them, heavy and deliberate. It wasn't about the club. It was about the line. Who stood on which side of it? Who decided? For a moment, everyone expected it to happen. The street did. The air did. Violence leaned forward, ready to be chosen. This was how these moments usually ended. A swing. A body on the ground. A story told wrong the next day. Bumpy didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look angry. His eyes stayed steady, measuring not the doorman, but the situation. The witnesses. The future. "Take your hand off me," Bumpy said. The doorman smiled. It wasn't wide. It was thin and satisfied. He leaned closer, lowering his voice so only Bumpy could hear. "Or what?" he said. Behind them, someone cleared their throat. Another person took a step back, instinctively. A woman whispered something to her escort. The night tightened. Bumpy glanced down at the hand on his chest. Then he looked back up, meeting the doorman's eyes again. "Or nothing," Bumpy said. "Tonight." The word "tonight" landed softly, but it changed the temperature. The doorman felt it, even if he didn't understand why. He laughed once, sharp and dismissive. "That's what I thought," he said, and finally pulled his hand away. "Move along." Bumpy adjusted his coat where the hand had been. Slow, careful, like a man fixing something that mattered. He didn't argue. He didn't threaten. He turned and stepped away from the door, giving the doorman exactly what he thought. He wanted. As Bumpy walked down the sidewalk, Heads turned. Some faces showed relief, others confusion. A few watched him with something closer to fear, not of what he'd done, but of what he hadn't. Halfway down the block, Bumpy stopped. By the time Bumpy Johnson reached 135th Street, the night had settled back into its familiar rhythm. Storefronts glowed soft behind dusty glass. A man swept the same patch of sidewalk he'd swept for 20 years. Somewhere a radio hummed low, carrying a gospel tune that sounded older than the block itself. Bumpy walked like he belonged to the street because he did, not by claim. By record. Men nodded when they saw him, not exaggerated, not fearful. Just acknowledgement, respect that didn't need explanation. A look that said, "We see you," and another that said, "We know you see us too." He stopped outside a small bar that didn't advertise itself. No sign, just a narrow door and a light that stayed on even when business was slow. Inside, the air was warm with smoke and familiarity. Conversations lowered not because Bumpy demanded silence, but because people listened when he entered. He took his usual seat near the wall, not the center, never the center. Power didn't need the spotlight. A glass appeared in front of him. Without being ordered, the bartender didn't ask questions. He never did. He slid the glass forward and said only one thing, "You good?" Bumpy nodded once, "I'm fine." The bartender hesitated, then leaned closer. Words already moving. Bumpy didn't respond. He lifted the glass, took a slow sip, and set it back down. The silence was permission enough. Across the room, a younger man shifted in his chair, restless. He'd been watching the door all night. He finally spoke, unable to hold it in. "That man at the club," he said carefully. "He don't know who he touched." Bumpy's eyes lifted, calm but firm. The young man stopped mid-sentence. "People know," Bumpy said. "That's enough." But Harlem did know. That was the problem, and the solution. By midnight, the story had already changed hands half a dozen times, not exaggerated, not embellished, just passed along intact. A hand on the chest. A door closed. Bumpy Johnson turned away. That last part unsettled people, because Harlem understood patterns, understood restraint, understood that when Bumpy didn't answer an insult, it wasn't forgiveness. It was planning. He finished his drink and stood. Conversations resumed around him, but quieter now. A few men watched him leave, instinctively aware that whatever came next wouldn't announce itself. Outside, the street felt wider, calmer. Bumpy walked a few blocks to a brownstone that had seen better paint and worse winters. Inside, the front room was lit low. Two men sat waiting. They didn't rise. They didn't rush. They trusted the order of things. One of them spoke first. "You want it handled?" Bumpy removed his coat and draped it carefully over a chair. He loosened his tie, slow and deliberate, as if time itself were something he controlled. "No," he said. The word landed heavy. The other man frowned slightly. He crossed a line. "I know," Bumpy said. "That's why we're not touching it yet." Silence followed, respectful, expectant. Bumpy moved to the window and looked out at the street below. Harlem breathed beneath him, quiet footsteps, distant laughter, the low murmur of a neighborhood that had learned to survive by paying attention. "They want a reaction," Bumpy said. "They always do. Noise. Something they can point to and call us animals." He turned back to the room. His face was calm, almost gentle. "We don't give them that." One of the men nodded slowly. He'd seen this before. Knew how it ended. "What do we do?" he asked. "We let it sit," Bumpy said. "We let New York look at it. Let them see the door. Let them see who stood behind it." The men exchanged a glance. This wasn't about the doorman anymore. It was about what the city believed it could get away with. Bumpy sat down, folding his hands loosely in front of him. "Every man in Harlem hears this story," he said. And every man outside Harlem hears it too. Some will laugh. Some will feel safe. A pause. Safety makes people careless. Later that night, Bumpy walked alone again. Past churches, past closed shops, past stoops where men had once sat guarding nothing but dignity. He stopped briefly to speak with an older woman locking up her store. She smiled at him like a nephew. "Stay dry, Ellsworth," she said. He smiled back. "Always do." That was the difference. Harlem didn't call him Bumpy when it mattered. Harlem knew his real name, knew the man behind the legend, knew he wasn't loud, wasn't reckless, wasn't cruel. He was patient. And patience, in a city like New York, was the most dangerous thing there was. As the night thinned and the streets grew quiet, the insult at the club stayed exactly where it was, untouched, unanswered, alive. Not buried. Not forgotten. Waiting. The doorman woke the next morning with the kind of confidence that comes from surviving something you thought might hurt you. He shaved slow, hummed while he dressed, lingered in the mirror a moment longer than usual. Nothing had happened. No call. No shadow at the door. No reckoning in the night. He told himself the story he needed to hear. Just another loudmouth turned quiet when it mattered. At the club, the manager clapped him on the shoulder. "Good work last night," he said. "You handled it clean." Clean. That word mattered. Clean meant no scene, no broken glass, no police. Clean meant the rules had held. The doorman stood taller because of it. What he didn't see were the pauses, the small hesitations, the way conversations shifted when his name came up. He didn't notice the bartender across town who stopped mid-sentence when someone mentioned the club, or the numbers runner who chose a different street that afternoon, or the man who'd once laughed loud about Harlem and now laughed quieter. Bumpy Johnson didn't move. That was the first thing that made people uneasy. Days passed. The club stayed open. Music played. Money changed hands. The doorman worked his post, shoulders squared, eyes sharp. He waited for something to happen, ready to react, almost hoping for it. Nothing did, but Harlem moved without appearing. A delivery arrived late one afternoon, 2 hours past schedule, no explanation. The liquor supplier sent word they'd be short on a few bottles that week. A regular patron didn't show, then another. And another. The manager frowned but said nothing. Businesses had rhythms. Sometimes they shifted. Across the city, Bumpy sat in quiet rooms, listening more than he spoke. Men came to him not for orders, but for understanding. He gave them none, only a look. Only silence. "Let it breathe," he said once. That was all. The doorman's confidence began to thin. He felt it first in the way eyes slid past him instead of meeting his, in the way laughter stopped just a beat too early, in the way men who once argued now agreed too quickly. One night, as he stepped out back for air, he noticed a man across the alley, leaning against a wall, not watching him directly, just present. The man tipped his hat once, polite, and walked away. The doorman felt a chill crawl up his spine. Not fear, something worse. Awareness. Inside the club, the owner's voice dropped when he spoke. "You. Sure you didn't recognize him?" he asked. "Recognize who?" The doorman said, defensive now. "The man the other night." The doorman shrugged. "Just another one who thought money bought him entry." The owner studied him carefully. "Some money buys more than that." Still, nothing happened. That was the genius of it. Bumpy Johnson didn't need to threaten. Didn't need to announce consequences. The city itself did the work for him. New York had a long memory for men who embarrassed it quietly. By the end of the week, the doorman felt watched even when he wasn't. He caught himself checking reflections, pausing mid-step, listening too closely to footsteps that weren't there. He told himself he was imagining it. Meanwhile, In Harlem, Bumpy walked the streets like he always had. He stopped to speak to a shopkeeper whose rent had gone up unfairly. He listened to a church elder talk about a broken roof. He settled. A disagreement between two young men with a look and a sentence. "Don't make me come back to this," he said. They nodded. That was enough. That was the contrast the city couldn't ignore. Downtown, a man stood at a door deciding who belonged. Uptown, a man moved through his neighborhood making sure everyone did. Word reached the club quietly. Not warnings, observations, things. "Feel different," one of the waiters said. The owner agreed. "They do." Still, he did nothing. Men in his position rarely did until they had to. The doorman started drinking more, just a little, to steady his nerves. To quiet the thoughts he couldn't finish, one evening a man approached the door he didn't recognize. Well-dressed, calm. He handed over a membership card without a word. The doorman checked it. Everything was in order. As the man stepped inside, he paused, turned back, met the doorman's eyes. "You know," the man said mildly, "some doors stay open even when they look closed." Then he walked away. The doorman stood frozen, unsure why the words unsettled him so deeply. Across town, Bumpy received a visit from a man who didn't often visit anyone. "They're nervous," the man said. "The owners." Bumpy nodded. "Good. They want to fix it." Bumpy didn't smile. Fixing it means admitting it was broken. Silence filled the room. "They're not there yet," Bumpy said. "But they will be." That night, the doorman dreamed of doors. Endless doors. Each one closed before he reached it. He woke with his heart racing, sweat cooling on his neck. When he returned to work the next evening, a letter waited for him. No return address, no threat. Just a single line written neatly inside. "Some mistakes don't ask to be forgiven." His hand shook as he folded it back up. Still, no one touched him. That was the final lesson. Violence would have ended it. Blood would have simplified it. But this stretched the moment until it taught something deeper. Until it rewrote the rules in places no fists could reach. The doorman began to understand too late. This wasn't about punishment. It was about position. He had stood at a door and decided who mattered. Now the city was deciding the same about him, and Bumpy Johnson was letting it happen. The city didn't explode. It never did when Bumpy Johnson was involved. It shifted. Quietly. Like a tide pulling back before anyone noticed the water was gone. The story that began at a single door no longer belonged to the doorman. It didn't even belong to the club. It belonged to New York, now passed from barbershops to back rooms, from taxicabs to card tables. Always the same details. Always the same ending. Bumpy Johnson was stopped. Bumpy Johnson said nothing. Bumpy Johnson walked away. That was the part people couldn't let go of, because violence would have explained it. Rage would have satisfied it. Silence made it dangerous. The club's owners felt it first in reputation. Invitations went unanswered. Members stopped bringing guests. A quiet discomfort settled over the room each night, as if the walls themselves were listening. One evening, a well-dressed man declined entry and turned to the owner, who happened to be standing near the door. "Nothing personal," the man said. "I just don't like how this place does business." The owner forced a smile. "We run a respectable establishment." The man nodded. "That's what I'm questioning." He left without waiting for a reply. Inside, the doorman stood rigid, eyes forward. He'd learned not to ask questions. Not anymore. The disrespect had moved beyond him. It had become symbolic. A reminder of old lines people thought still held. Lines that were starting to blur in uncomfortable ways. Uptown, Bumpy attended a church. Service he rarely missed. He sat in the same pew he'd sat in for years. When the congregation stood, he stood. When they bowed their heads, he did the same. Afterward, an older man approached him. Voice low. "They talking," he said. Bumpy nodded. "I know. You going to answer?" Bumpy looked toward the doors of the church, open to the street. Sunlight spilled in, dust dancing in it like something alive. "Already have," he said. The power of the moment wasn't in what Bumpy did. It was in what he allowed others to see. He didn't hide, didn't withdraw, didn't posture. He let the insult exist in daylight. That choice unsettled people far more than any private retaliation could have downtown. The doorman felt the shift like pressure in his ears. His authority thinned with each night. People still came in, but they watched him differently now, measured him, judged him. One man paused before entering and said, almost casually, "You're the one, huh?" The doorman didn't answer. Man smiled faintly. "Thought so." That was all. But it was enough. The owner finally made the call. Not to Bumpy. Not yet. To a man who knew men. "I want this smoothed over," he said. The man on the other end listened, then replied carefully. "Smoothing means you admit fault." A pause. "That door wasn't just a door," the man said. "It was a statement." Silence followed. "You don't erase statements," he continued. "You replace them." The owner hung up with a knot in his chest. Back in Harlem, Bumpy met with men who never raised their voices around him. Not because he demanded it, but because shouting felt unnecessary. They're feeling it. One said, "They will." Bumpy replied. Another man shifted. "You want to make it right with them?" Bumpy's gaze lifted, calm, steady. "I want." It made right with Harlem. That was the difference. The insult had never been about him alone. It was about every man who'd been stopped at a door and told, without words, where he stood. By letting it play out publicly, Bumpy turned a private humiliation into a lesson the city couldn't ignore. Newspapers didn't print it. They didn't need to. The story lived where print couldn't reach. One night, the doorman was pulled aside. By the owner. "This ends," the owner said. "Tonight." The doorman swallowed. "How?" The owner hesitated. "That depends." On the street outside, Bumpy walked past the club without slowing. He didn't look at the door. Didn't acknowledge the place at all. But others did. They noticed. The next morning, the doorman didn't show up for work. No announcement. No explanation. Just absence. The club opened late that night. A new man stood at the door, younger, quieter. His posture was different, not defensive, not arrogant. Just alert. When a well-dressed man approached and asked, "This place still got rules?" The new doorman answered carefully. "Yes," he said. "Respect is one of them." The man nodded and stepped inside. Uptown Bumpy received word. He listened. Without reaction. "Good," he said. He didn't claim victory. Didn't mark the moment. He knew better. Disrespect made public had done its work. The city had seen the line and watched it dissolve, not with force, but with exposure. The door was no longer the same door, and neither was New York. By the time anyone realized the balance had shifted, it was already settled. There was no announcement, no celebration, no single moment people could point to and say that's when it happened. Power rarely moved that way when Bumpy Johnson was involved. It moved like ownership, quiet, unquestioned, permanent. The club remained open. The music still played. The lights still glowed warm against the night. But something essential had changed. Not policy. Not clientele. Tone. The new doorman didn't block anyone out of habit. He watched first, listened, measured the room before making decisions. When men approached who carried themselves with calm authority, he didn't test them. He nodded and stepped aside. The door had learned something. Downtown, owners adjusted without admitting why. Invitations were extended differently. Conversation softened. Jokes that once landed heavy were no longer told. Men who prided themselves on exclusivity now spoke. Carefully about image and perception. Uptown, Bumpy continued exactly as before. He visited the same barber. Sat in the same chair. Let the same man trim his hair with hands that never shook. They talked about the weather. About a boy on the block who needed work. About nothing that sounded important to outsiders, but importance wasn't always loud. About nothing that sounded important to outsiders, but importance wasn't outsiders, but importance wasn't always loud. About nothing that sounded important to outside. Man approached Bumpy outside the shop, hesitant but respectful. He spoke quietly. "They won't say it," the man said. "But they know," Bumpy nodded. "Knowing changes behavior." "That enough for you?" Bumpy considered the question. "It has to be. Because domination wasn't about humiliation. It wasn't about revenge. It was about correction. About restoring order without breaking the city you lived in. The man who'd once stood with his hand on Bumpy's chest was gone from the story now, not erased. Just irrelevant. Reduced to a lesson passed along without his name attached. That was the real consequence. One evening, Bumpy was invited to a gathering downtown. Not at the same club. Somewhere quieter, neutral ground. The invitation came through 3 hands before it reached him. He read it once, folded it, set it aside. He didn't attend. Refusal carried more weight than acceptance ever could. The message traveled back the way it came. Understood without explanation. Bumpy's power had never depended on being let in. It came from deciding where he needed to be and where he didn't. In Harlem, people felt the shift even if they couldn't articulate it. Doors opened easier. Conversations carried less tension. Young men walked taller, not reckless, but steadier. An older woman stopped Bumpy on the street and said, "Things feel calmer." He smiled faintly. That's how they should feel. Calm was the product. Calm was the goal. New York had expected violence. It always did. It understood blood better than patience. But patience rewrote the rules in ways violence never could. There were no headlines, no police reports, no funerals. Just a subtle realignment of respect. That was domination, and it belonged to Bumpy Johnson. Years later, men would argue about the night like it was a rumor they almost remembered correctly. Some would say the doorman vanished. Others would swear Bumpy had him dealt with quietly. A few would insist nothing really happened. At all of them would be wrong. What happened wasn't dramatic enough to satisfy imagination. It was too controlled, too clean. And because of that, it lasted. New York didn't learn the lesson in one night. It absorbed it slowly, the way cities absorb truth through behavior. Through changes no one announces. Through doors that open a second sooner. Through hands that stay at a man's side instead of on his chest. The club never apologized publicly. It didn't need to. Its survival depended on understanding what it had done and never repeating it. And it didn't. Not there. Not anywhere connected to it. Other places took notice. Men who ran doors started asking different questions. Not who can I stop, but who am I stopping? Owners listened more closely to the people they trusted. Some didn't understand why at first. They just knew the city felt less forgiving of old habits. That was Bumpy's real reach. He never demanded credit. Never corrected the stories. Never stood up and claimed authority he already possessed. Harlem didn't need him to explain himself. Harlem watched. And Harlem remembered. Bumpy continued his routines. Paid for funerals no one connected to him publicly. Made sure families stayed fed when breadwinners didn't come home. Broke up conflicts. before they turned into grudges. Kept violence rare and purposeful when it couldn't be avoided. That restraint became part of his legacy to outsiders. He was dangerous because of what he could do. To Harlem, he was powerful because of what he chose not to. The night at the door became shorthand, not for anger, for patience, for the understanding that respect didn't always announce itself loudly, but once withdrawn, it was almost impossible to get back. A young man once asked an older one about it years later, "So what did Bumpy do?" he asked. The older man looked at him for a long moment, then shook his head. He let the city answer for him. That answer shaped more than one club, more than one street. It shaped how New York thought about power when it couldn't hide behind uniforms or titles or inherited privilege, because the lesson wasn't about race alone. It was about arrogance, about mistaking silence for weakness, about assuming a door could define a man. Bumpy Johnson proved something different, that real authority didn't need to push, didn't need to shout, didn't need to strike first. It waited. And when it moved, it didn't leave wreckage. It left order. That's why his name stayed spoken carefully long after others faded into footnotes. Not because he demanded fear, but because he earned permanence. York learned that night that some men don't force their way in. They make the world adjust until it realizes it was already standing in their way. And once it learns that the door never closes the same way again,